All right, we call the meeting to order of the Waynesboro City Council on June 27th, 2022. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. For me, it seems like it's been a long time since I've been in here for a council meeting.
Right.
But it's only been 2 sessions, so welcome everyone here tonight. Terry, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
My pleasure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I woke you up when I smashed it.
What's that? Yeah, you did. More aggressive than usual.
Haven't used it. All right. For those in attendance tonight that wish to speak during our one public hearing or citizen comment period, there's a sign-up sheet in the back of the room here. Please sign up on the appropriate sheet. Make sure you look at the title of the sheet and you're signing up for either citizen comment or the public hearing. And we'll explain the rules once we get up to those parts of the program here. Item number 3 is to adopt the meeting agenda. Has everyone had a chance to review the meeting agenda? Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as presented?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Is there a second?
A second.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Thank you all very much. And item number 4 is matters from mayor. I've got a couple of things I wanted to go over tonight. Tomorrow night, June 28th, 2022, the Parks and Recreation Department will hold a grand opening of our new pickleball courts out at Ridgeview Park. If you've not been out there recently, the tennis courts had 5 courts on it. They took 1 court off and put 4 pickleball courts into 1 tennis court. So now we've got 4 tennis courts and 4 pickleball courts out there. The ceremony will begin at 6 p.m. and I've been told that I've been challenged by a member of Parks and Recs to play this game. So tomorrow night at 6 p.m. we'll be out at the Parks and Recs playing pickleball. On July 9th at about 9:45 p.m. Parks and Recs will also provide the annual fireworks display, recently branded as Sunset Spectacular. The display will shoot from the former landfill and visible from downtown Waynesboro and various points throughout the city. That same day, at about 2 p.m., the Waynesboro Downtown Spectacular will have its first Downtown Spectacular from 2 p.m. until 9:30 when the fireworks starts. There will be food trucks and other vendors, music, and family entertainment down in Lumos Plaza, downtown Waynesboro. It's a great time to come out and join summer fun and kick off summer with your friends and family down here in downtown Waynesboro. If you've never been down there, the Lumos Plaza, it's a pretty big plaza, and it will hold a bunch of food trucks and a lot of people. So come out and support your city, come out and support your downtown businesses, and when you come down to have a little fun, shop in our downtown. So that's all I have. Are there any matters from council members?
Yep, just share appreciation. Was able to join with Mayor Henderson and Dr. Hofstetter the NAACP Juneteenth celebration over at Ridgeview Park, and was wonderful as a kickoff. Their first time out of holding the event, and the mayor had some great words to share with the group, and music and food and fun times were had by all. So congratulations to them.
Thank you, Terry.
I've got my update. My mask is back on. It was going to be off when we slipped back into green, but we're back into yellow. So, stay tuned. Hopefully it won't get worse. Our numbers are still tending to be low. Augusta County a little bit higher for our COVID cases, but we did slip back into yellow, so you see my mask back. Vaccination still available. I encourage people to talk to folks about when they're due for their boosters if they haven't had boosters, or for their original series if they're still looking for that. But hopefully we will see our numbers continue to stay low through the summer. Being outside and getting lots of fresh air and good ventilation is good. And so, just show common sense when you're out and about.
Thank you, Doc.
And also wanted to add into your comments about the fireworks. That morning, Saturday morning, there will be the Parks and Rec Sunrise Spectacular 5K and 10K. So the city council is all going to be out there running, is what I hear. Really? Okay. But it's a good time, and hopefully it'll be good weather for it as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Doc.
They're right after the pickleball.
Okay.
After the pickleball tournament, exactly. All right, that brings us to item number 6, and item number 6 is to consider approving our consent agenda. Has everyone had a chance to review that and go over the details? Is there a motion to adopt our consent agenda for tonight?
I will make that motion.
Thank you, Dr. Hofstetter. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Allen.
Short.
Short. Short Allen. Thank you, Mr. Short.
We are kidding. So.
It's been a long day. Is there any discussion on this? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Thank you all very much. And just for those that are wondering why there's only 4 of us up here tonight, Ms. Williams had an appointment tonight and couldn't make it in here, so that's the reason there's only 4 of us up here. Item number 7 is to consider amending the City of Waynesboro dates of employment policy as it relates to leave and accrual. Mr. Hamp.
Yes, sir. As part of an ongoing effort to attract and retain qualified employees, the city staff recommends updating our adjusted accrual date in the city's dates of employment policy to recognize prior Virginia retirement system service. The adjusted accrual date determines the rate at which employees earn annual leave or paid time off. Currently, the adjusted accrual date only impacts an employee if they leave and return to employment with the city. The recommended change allows prior VRS service to be factored in regardless of whether those years of service were with the city of Waynesboro. So as I indicated in the work session and in conversation separately, we really think this is an opportunity to improve our position with respect to attracting employees with experience and recognizing that experience presumably with another municipality, or it simply has to be a VRS covered employer with respect to how they accrue leave, and makes it us as a more attractive employment opportunity for those folks with experience.
Any questions for Mr. Hamp? Perfect. Is there a motion to approve the recommended changes of dates of employment policy?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Any discussion?
I just want to share my appreciation to staff for coming up with creative solutions to increase our competitiveness. So thank you.
I'll pass that along. Appreciate it.
And I was going to make the same thing. I mean, this just gives us another leg up. It's hard to get people attracted to your city. This just gives us a leg up over some of our other cities. So all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Thank you all very much. Item number 8 is to consider adopting resolution support of the city's smart scale application to VDOT. I believe this is round 5, isn't it, Mr. Jude?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council.
Thank you, Bruce.
It's Smart Scale time again, your favorite time of the every other year. Smart Scale 2022, this is round 4 of the Smart Scale program, so you all have seen all this before. But Smart Scale is a state program that governs the disbursement of state grant funds for new transportation infrastructure, not for maintenance. That's funded through a different program, and it's held every 2 years. It's the successor to the old 6-year improvement plan system. It was supposed to replace the political system with a more objective one that would essentially be a large contest in which localities could submit projects and then have them scored on a number of metrics and try to ensure that state transportation funds were used wisely and actually to make improvements. Waynesboro can submit up to 4 applications each cycle. There are 6 metrics, 5 for us, on how projects are scored. Safety, congestion mitigation, accessibility, economic development, and environmental quality. and each round they tweak and update the way that they score those things. We have been extremely successful in the Smart Scale program so far. In the last 3 rounds, Waynesboro has received funding for 6 different projects, totaling well over about $40 million. These include the Southern Connector, Shenandoah Village Drive Extension, which was funded in the first round. That ran into a number of problems with the Army Corps of Engineers and environmental permitting, but it is forging ahead now. It should go to construction possibly next year or the year after. The East Main Streetscape and Multi-Use Path, which should go to design, I believe, next year. The 13th and Rosser Roundabout, which we are very close to beginning design on. The Broad Street Streetscape and Access Management Program, or Streetscape Project, and then the West Main Street Stars Study Improvements, which will also be beginning sort of a pre-design phase soon. And then the Rosser Avenue Corridor Signal Timing and Safety Improvements, which are scheduled a ways out still. We have been, I will say we've been so successful in recent rounds that you need to have a project prepared. You need to have a decent amount of advanced planning and engineering prep work done in order to really compete reasonably for a plan. As Mr. Woods says, as an engineer, you have to spend a certain percentage of your budget just to know how big your budget has to be, to know how much a project is going to cost. And so we can't just come up with projects out of thin air. And so that's why we're only submitting 3 projects this round. And that's partially because we've been so successful in the past, and we probably need to go into a more aggressive planning cycle again. Stanton's not submitting any projects this round. So our 2022 applications are, first of all, the Exit 94 off-ramp. This proposal would add a second lane to the Exit 94 off-ramp at westbound I-64. The goal is to resolve a queuing problem there, where during high-volume periods, especially during the evening rush hour, cars queue onto the interstate, which is a pretty dangerous situation if folks are flying down and suddenly there's a line of cars coming off the off-ramp. It also would add some capacity as development continues in that area. The second proposal is probably the biggest one here. It's for a roundabout at the Broad Rosser Main intersection. This is currently the city's highest ranked PSI intersection. That's potential for safety improvement, which is a VDOT rating of all intersections in the district, which goes all the way up to Winchester, of intersections that are currently dangerous and could be improved. So it's not just a measure of danger, but a level of how much they believe they could be improved. And it's our highest PSI intersection that does not currently have a study or improvement project underway. Back in 2020, VDOT completed an intersection analysis and released a technical memorandum for us, working with the city, that recommended a roundabout based on the trips and the configuration of the right-of-way there. VDOT has helped the city to prepare a proposed sketch. It's just a concept idea. The idea is a roundabout at that intersection that they believe can be achieved without having to purchase or take any businesses. That will involve a small amount of right-of-way. Why a roundabout? I know we get a lot of questions. Why is the city proposing so many roundabouts? I will say that roundabouts are a big change. They're often a big change for drivers. We hope that change will be gradual. We're looking at potentially having a roundabout be constructed possibly next year, and then possibly another one scheduled another year or 2 out from that. And then this would be several years beyond that. So we think they'll come in slowly. We think people will have time to adjust to them. But that said, they're dramatically safer. They reduce collisions by about 40% and reduce by about 90% your chance of being in a fatal injury or having a serious accident. Essentially by deflecting the direction and by slowing folks down through the intersection, they really reduce accidents. They also involve reduced maintenance and replacement cost. You don't have to deal with electricity, with mastheads, signal poles, a lot of the technology that's involved in signals. They also improve pedestrian safety and accessibility, usually by reducing pedestrian fatalities by about 60%. And they actually slightly improve the traffic flow. They're also, I believe in this case, and this isn't a reason to do it necessarily, but this is an opportunity, I think, for an aesthetic improvement at a key focal point of the city. That's really the central intersection of the city. If you look on a map of the city, it's in the dead middle, and a lot of our main corridors come together right there. And so you can see the current intersection is both hostile to pedestrians, and it's sort of a wide open slab of concrete. I think this is an opportunity to create more of an entrance feature, of an urban design opportunity there as an entrance to our downtown. So that's the roundabout proposal. Third project is the Crozet Tunnel, which you know lots about. Again, kind of like last time, this is kind of a speculative project. We don't think that it'll get funded. The way that the metrics are set up, it just doesn't score particularly well, but there's not an ideal grant. We still think it's a really important project for economic development in the future, but there isn't sort of a grant project that's ideal for it. It does improve pedestrian safety and provide some, alternative routing, but it's not sort of necessarily how the Smart Scale program is set up. That said, it does score somewhat, and there's been quite a bit of funding injected into the program, and so we felt it's a project that we have already. We didn't have 4 applications. It's worth putting it in. I think there's always a possibility it could get funded. So those are all our proposed applications. As far as strategic considerations go, like I said, we just didn't have the sort of the projects in the hopper, and I think for that reason, we were kind of coming out of a period where we had a lot of clear priorities out of the comprehensive plan. We had really a list of things that we needed to address, and we've really effectively lined up funding for almost all of those projects. So I think we're reaching a point where the city needs to consider going back into a comprehensive planning phase, going into a transportation planning phase, and really trying to assess what are our needs now, what are the priorities now. So, any questions?
Good job, Luke.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, is there a motion to approve the resolution supporting the city's smart scale application?
I will make that motion.
Thank you, Dr. Hofstetter. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Any discussion?
I'll just be abstaining as an employee of the Virginia Department of Transportation.
Okay. All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Abstain.
Motion carries 3-0, 1 abstained. Thank you all very much. Item number 9 is to hold a public hearing and consider introducing an ordinance amending the city code section 98-5, 1.3.b dash parking maximum requirements. Mr. Duday, you're back up.
Thank you. This is amendment to our parking requirements. There is an applicant in this case. It's a local developer. The applicant has requested this amendment to our parking maximum ordinance. The reason is that they're interested in pursuing 2 major national restaurant chains, which have expressed interest in locating in the city that would, provide obviously a lot of economic development opportunity. These restaurants require more parking than our ordinance permits in the desired location. And looking at the proposal, staff felt that it wasn't a huge problem to accommodate that. So we're proposing to amend our ordinance. The relevant fact here is the corridor overlay district, which is laid out in green. These are our major entrance corridors. The corridor overlay has extra requirements. One of those is that non-residential uses, any kind of commercial use that requires 50 or more parking spaces, cannot provide more than 110% of the minimum number of spaces required under the parking ratio requirements below. So it's really a pretty narrow window that our ordinance holds them to. I think in general the planning profession is trending against parking requirements these days. Parking maximums are sort of a debatable subject, but like I said, this creates a very narrow window within 10% of the parking that they're required to provide. And this maximum does not apply to HB parcels that are not in the corridor overlay districts. So there's a lot of sort of if not clauses here. But in this case, the parcel in question is an HB parcel and it is in the corridor overlay district. So the original ordinance was intended to protect the viewshed of the city's entrance corridors. The idea was to prevent huge parking lots from fronting on the roads coming in. You can kind of see some examples from before and after some of our corridor overlay zoning and landscape ordinance. Like this is a shopping center that was constructed before the corridor overlay district. You can see you're driving in and you just see a sea of parking, building setback. With the corridor overlay district, you're required to have a maximum 90-foot setback. It really only allows 1 rack of parking, and then other parking has to be off to the side or behind the building. So it creates a little bit better sense of enclosure driving into the city, which is sort of a core urban design concept. You want a good ratio between the building height and the width. The proposed amendment would add this exception. It would say that for parcels that are zoned HB within the corridor overlay district, parking spaces in excess of the maximum should be screened from view from the corridor by any of the following or a combination thereof, either the principal structure or a solid fence or masonry wall at least 6 feet in height and a minimum 5-foot vegetative planting strip with at least 12 shrubs or trees per 100 linear feet. So it essentially provides an exception to the exception here. Any parking that's in excess of that maximum in the corridor would have to be screened. Here's an example of that kind of buffer that's on a completely different type of property, but a solid masonry wall and then a vegetative strip. Essentially, the idea here is, for instance, you have a corridor like Rosser Avenue. You have a structure in that corridor overlay district. It's allowed a maximum 90-foot setback from the road. So then you have parking within the allowable maximum, and again, you have parking within the allowable maximum. But then, if they would like to exceed the allowable maximum, they'll have to screen it either behind the building or behind a fence wall and landscape buffer. And these are all the parcels that it would impact, all the HB parcels that are located within the corridor overlay district. Planning Commission recommends approval of the proposed amendment. I believe it provides an economic development opportunity with pretty minimal impact to the corridor. All this means is that if they need a few additional parking spaces above, if our parking maximum would limit them to 65 parking spaces and they require 85, those additional 20 would have to be behind the building, behind something. So we feel that it doesn't have a huge impact on the corridor. And for that reason, staff recommend approval as well. Thanks.
Any questions for Luke?
I actually do have a question. The picture you showed us, the wall was right sort of up against the street.
Yeah.
And when the diagram you showed sort of, they put it back behind, is there?
Yeah. As I
Because I
mentioned,
don't think that's much more attractive than
no, this
a large
is
parking lot.
well. This is actually from a completely different situation. This is a recycling center, and they had to build a wall around the recycling center because they're next to some houses. So yeah, this would be we would be talking about something that's towards the back of the property, generally. Yeah, they would not be required to screen all their parking, only the parking that exceeds the maximum.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard with aesthetic stuff to really regulate it effectively because what looks good to one person doesn't to another person, and there's always loopholes in the code. So we tend to stick with stuff that sometimes it doesn't always look ideal, but at least it's objective. You can enforce it on a site plan. So.
You good, Terry?
Good.
All right. All right, so I'm going to open the public hearing up, and just for those that are participating in the, do we have anybody signed up?
We have not. No, sir.
Okay. All right, so there's no one signed up for the public hearing. I was going to explain, you got 4 minutes to speak, but I opened the public hearing, no one signed up. I closed the public hearing. Thank you very much. All right, is there a motion to introduce this ordinance tonight?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Is there a second?
I will second that motion.
Thank you, Dr. Hosstetter. Any discussion? All right, this ordinance will be received at our final consideration at our next regular business meeting, which is, what is the date of that?
I think it's the 11th. Yes, sir, the 11th.
July 11th. Perfect, thank you all. All right, item number 10. Oh, there's two public hearings then. Item number 10 is to hold a public hearing and consider introducing an ordinance amending the City Code, Chapter 74 Subdivisions. Mr. Uday.
Be a little sick of me by the end of this meeting, but this is a proposed amendment to our subdivision ordinance that the Planning Commission's been working on for a little while. Staff have been working on for longer than that. But it affects how our by right subdivisions are considered. I'm going to do a little bit of review in this. I think it'll be helpful for the public, hopefully, just to understand the process of how developments often come about. But in Waynesboro, a subdivision is any action that alters the boundaries of a lot. You can distinguish them from rezonings, and that a rezoning is a discretionary action, like a conditional use permit or a text amendment. It's something that you have the option to do or not do. A subdivision is a by right action. If you are subdividing in accordance with the code, you are entitled to that subdivision. And if the city doesn't give it to you, you can sue for it. So we have a distinction in our code between major and minor subdivisions. Minor subdivisions just have a simplified administrative process. Staff reviews them and signs the plat. And that is only if the lot is on an already improved public street and they don't require any waivers. No more than 6 lots are created. Essentially, the street already exists, the land's right there, just need to cut it up. The key distinction really here is construction and dedication of public infrastructure. That's what knocks people up to a major subdivision. And that's, you really want to extend the city. You want to extend the street network or the pipe network. And for that, we have the major subdivision process, which has 3 parts. The first part is a preliminary plat. This involves a public hearing before Planning Commission and City Council, in which you have to show the overall layout, any phasing. It's not a legal document, it's not recorded, but it creates predictability for the development. And so everyone gets to consider it in the public meeting, hold public hearings, adopt it. Then once they have a preliminary plat, the applicant can submit a public improvement plan, and these are detailed construction drawings for their roads and their pipes and everything. Those are subject to administrative review, and then the applicant, once it's approved, can build that stuff, build the streets, or they can bond the cost of construction. Then, once that's done, they can submit a final plat, and that shows the final placement of all the lot lines and rights-of-way, and it can't be approved until this infrastructure is completed or bonded. Once the final plat is signed, and that also is just administrative review, they can record it at the courthouse and start selling lots. So I just did this quick overview of how developments happen with the example of Creekwood Village subdivision. It began with a rezoning, and many of them do. So this is where the entitlement was changed in August of 2020. This was a discretionary action. You could have chosen to vote no then, and they would not have been able to build what they built. But then they came back in January 2021 with a preliminary plat. Again, this was a by right action. So we had a public hearing and an opportunity for people to speak to it, but they were actually entitled to approval of it as long as they met the standards of the ordinance. This preliminary plat is valid for 5 years, and that gets extended with each new phase. So then after that was approved, really concurrently with it, they submitted a public improvement plan to staff, and these are detailed construction drawings and cross sections showing all the infrastructure that the city would have to take control of. Oftentimes, in the midst of engineering these, this prompts amendments to the preliminary plat, which then forces applicants to come back for another round of public hearings to alter them. And you saw that happen as well. It happened with Ivy Creek recently, or Ivy Commons. So then, once they completed that, they completed some of the infrastructure and bonded some of the other infrastructure, they were able to submit a final plat, which is an actual legal document showing a survey. And this was approved, staff signed it, could be recorded at the courthouse as of February 2022, and that means that they can begin construction on their homes and begin selling lots. So that's the whole process. Some of the problems that we have been dealing with are, first of all, the review deadline. The state code gives the city a maximum of 60 days to review and respond to a subdivision plat. This becomes very difficult to do under the current system because from final submission to planning commission to council, it generally takes us about 3 months. So that puts us at legal risk if we have not technically either approved or disapproved their subdivision. They could file a suit and get a judge to approve the subdivision and say we met the ordinance, and they failed to act within their 60 days to review it. Secondly, the second problem is that we're holding public hearings on by right actions. Now, there's obviously little things that can be tweaked in a subdivision. A little sidewalk could be turned over here, there. Things that are sort of within what the ordinance says. But overall, you're inviting people to come and comment, and generally they're coming to speak against the whole project. But on something that the city has to vote yes on. So it's not a great situation for you as an elected official. Have a bunch of folks saying, don't do this, and then you raise your hand, you have to vote for it. It's also not a great situation for them, I think a waste of their time. Generally, you want to have public process, public hearings on discretionary actions that you have a choice in. And then things that are by right, you want to do administratively. And then lastly, the difficulty of amending the preliminary plat to address engineering issues. Again, engineering issues tend to be worked out with staff and in the field as they're building. But that tends to be done after the preliminary plat is approved. And so it makes it very difficult when suddenly there's a bunch of rock in the way and we need to slightly alter the right-of-way for one road or something like that. Technically, the code requires them to come back to you and do a whole new round of public hearings in order to get that plat amended. The second big thing prompting this change is a change to state law. The state passed a law stating that preliminary plats can no longer be required for subdivisions of 51 lots or fewer. So this was an attempt to accelerate the approval of subdivisions based on complaints from home building associations. So what do we do if there are public improvements? As of right now, under our code, which does not conform to the state law, we simply would have to proceed straight to submission of a site plan and public improvement plan, and then have them submit a final plat. And actually, this is what's going on down at Waynesboro Marketplace. There's small subdivision required for that would generally be a major subdivision. They would have to bring a preliminary plat to you all. It's really not a significant action, so I don't think it's hugely affected here. But they just submitted a public improvement plan, did it, submitted the plat, got it done because they're no longer required to have that preliminary plat. So no hearings at all in front of either planning commission or council. As far as how our neighbors do it, Stanton is still going to require preliminary plats for 51 lots plus, but it will only go to the planning commission. And they actually are somewhat odd in that their final plats go to planning commission and city council. Generally, it's reversed if anything goes to council. In Augusta County, all subdivisions are approved administratively. There's no board or planning commission action whatsoever. Harrisonburg, the preliminary plats go to planning commission only, and then the final plats are approved by staff. They do not involve council. Charlottesville, same thing. Preliminary plats go to planning commission, but not council. Final plats are approved by staff. Roanoke, all subdivisions, similar to Augusta County, all subdivisions are approved administratively, no planning commission or council. And then for Lynchburg, all subdivisions are approved administratively also, no planning commission or council. Generally, as localities get bigger, they send fewer things to commissions, elected bodies. But the planning commission's proposal is that we model more the Harrisonburg, Charlottesville system, where subdivisions with more than 50 lots would still require a preliminary plat and a public hearing before planning commission, but that planning commission public hearing would be the final approval. So there would still be an opportunity for people to come and speak, if they want to speak on some detail of it, tweaking elements of it, but it would significantly accelerate the process, and that you can just go straight to your planning commission public hearing and get approval. You don't need another month on top of that to go to council and get 2 readings. And then we would stick with administrative review of the final plats. For subdivisions with 50 or fewer lots, we're in a little bit of a bind. Either those are going to have to go directly to staff, and they would just never be seen. You could have a 45-lot large subdivision, and it would never be exposed to public comment. Planning Commission opted to try to find some way to address that, and so working with Litton and Sype, we've come up with an ordinance that would still require those to go to Planning Commission. Essentially, if you have infrastructure involved, if it's still a major subdivision, but there are 50 or fewer lots, the Planning Commission would have to review the final plat and public improvement plan, and they would give a conditional approval that would be contingent on completion of the infrastructure, at which point staff could sign it and approve it. So it would still involve bringing those to a Planning Commission public hearing, but without, the thing we were struggling with was just requiring a public hearing for the final plats means that you'd be holding a public hearing after everything was already built. So this would provide this conditional approval, which could then be signed after things were constructed. That's the proposed change. Additionally, a lot of our subdivisions are phased, meaning developers here tend to build, 10 houses at a time, 20 houses at a time. And so without a preliminary plat, the subdivision would have to be complete and in full accordance with the ordinance. You couldn't build a little bit and say, we're going to connect that road later. So that'll be sort of another incentive to bring a preliminary plat, and why you would want to have a preliminary plat, to be able to phase it. So yeah, new process for the subdivisions below 50 lots. The applicant will submit a plat with a public improvement plan. They'll have a public hearing before Planning Commission, concurrent with the staff review. Planning Commission will approve it, contingent on the completion of public improvements. And then once the infrastructure is completed, the subdivision agent will sign it and allow it to be recorded. So, Planning Commission recommends the amended ordinance as provided, as does staff, but it is a significant change, so I'd be happy to discuss it or take any questions. Yeah.
Any questions?
I had a question, just if you go back to the previous slide. Infrastructure completed or bonded, that's a term that I'm trying to wrap my head around there.
Yeah, essentially, you want to, you have a 10-acre parcel, you want to put 30 lots on it. You need to construct a road to city street standards, and then once the city has accepted that road as a public street, then you can have your lots. And so, but a lot of times folks, so one thing you can do is just build the street. We'll come out, inspect it. We say it's good. We take the street. But generally what happens is that the developer doesn't want to put the top coat on until the construction trucks are done rumbling through. Maybe they want to get going on some houses, but their street contractor's backed up. So what they'll do is they'll submit a surety, a bond, which will be a money that the city can pull if they go belly up and fail to finish the, because once we've given them the subdivision, they can sell that lot. Now you've got a homeowner that owns a lot, has a house, and there's no street in front of it. So the money needs to be there to build that street.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
that's what that means.
Good.
throw out the idea of, just for discussion, is that why not go all in? I mean, because from a preliminary plat standpoint, are we basically holding a carrot out for the public to sort of look at, but they can never obtain, right? Because at a preliminary plat stage, even after a public hearing, if it conforms to and it is a by right use, it doesn't matter what personal opinions the planning commission might have on it, you have to accept it.
Right. The commission felt there is some gray in our ordinance, right? So we require interconnectivity. What does that mean? Should the street connect here or should it connect over there? Or, there's some little things having to do with layout, or, should the stormwater pond be located on this side or that side, that it is possible to affect a little bit. Now, a lot of times that stuff's governed by engineering concerns, and it's questionable how much control we really have over it. But essentially, the Planning Commission felt that there should at least be one opportunity for at least there to be some public awareness of it. And if there are small things people want to comment on, sometimes somebody comes and says, that's my house right there. I wish that stormwater pond was turned a little bit so that there was, some trees right there, something tiny like that. But yeah, you do have to explain to them that's all that we can comment on. We're not talking about whether we like the subdivision or not. We're not talking about whether we want 40 lots there or not. We're only talking about little layout tweaks. And even then, so there's definitely an argument to be had to just eliminate hearings altogether. Planning Commission felt there should at least be one hearing,
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. I hereby open the public hearing.
No, sir.
I hereby close the public hearing. Is there a motion to introduce the change in ordinance as presented by Luke?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Any discussion? All right, this ordinance will be received for final consideration at the July 11th, 2022 council meeting. Item number 11 is to receive a presentation regarding the local housing market. Mr. Jude is back up.
It's the Luke Jude
I
show.
thought you put somebody in between my stuff so that I wouldn't. Well, sorry, you really do have to be sick of me now, but this is the last presentation you will ever have to hear from me, so
You think?
sad.
Don't say that.
Did you want to say something?
Sure. For the benefit of those who weren't present for the work session, housing is typically a topic of interest for communities and elected bodies, and increasingly so sort of in our region, the Shenandoah Valley, and across the Commonwealth for a variety of reasons. Much of that stemming to the rising costs of homes and housing generally. Maintaining a balance of housing types and various points of affordability is important to maintaining a healthy, attractive, and vibrant community. Increasingly, localities are pressed to consider housing in their communities and what role the local government should assume with respect to the housing market generally. Because these conversations about housing are occurring with more frequency, I thought it might be helpful to examine at a fundamental level how city leaders might think about housing in their community, what the vernacular is, and what opportunities there are if an elected body decides for itself that they'd like to take a more aggressive role with respect to housing. How would they do that? Housing is a complex topic and can often reflect a variety of considerations related to quality, affordability, public versus private, workforce, subsidized. And there are a number of agencies that work even with our own community to impact housing in various ways. For example, there's the Valley Mission, there's WARM, there's Habitat for Humanity. This presentation is for informational purposes, and I think in doing so, it may raise more questions than it answers. But I think as we've listened to public comment over the last 6 to 9 months, some of the comments have prompted me to consider my own familiarity with our housing market and what localities can and can't do and might do. And so really, no action is required, but I thought it would be helpful especially given Luke's talent, to have him speak just very generally on the topic of housing and get us more familiarized with what that means for a local elected body.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp. Do any of you remember this? Does this spark any memories? Yeah, this is from our comprehensive plan a few years ago. Part of the point of this diagram was they were saying that cities, as economic engines sort of ebb and flow, there's times when the economic engine is weak, cities are trying to get something going, and there's times when it's strong and the snowball's rolling and you're just kind of trying to keep up. So during that comprehensive plan, they asked a lot of people during public outreach, where do you think the city of Waynesboro is? And a lot of people thought we were about here. They thought we were maybe, we were in a trough from where we'd been in the past, but that things were sort of looking up. So I wanted to start this talk off on an optimistic note, that I would argue we're here, that we're doing very well. The city is booming, things are getting built. There's increased demand for Waynesboro, increased people who want to live here, people who want to work and play here, and that's a good thing. And the problem of affordable housing is coming out of that, and so it's a bad thing that's coming from a good thing. So let's keep that optimism in place. That affordable housing problems are partially a source come from higher demand. Second thing I'm going to say is that I'm not going to say affordable housing in this presentation. I think during a lot of public comment on any subdivision, the words affordable housing are always confusing. They always spark, I think, misconceptions of what's going on because the term is too broad. And really you're talking about two very distinct subjects. And so I'm going to talk about those two subjects and try to convey that they are separate topics, but also explain the ways in which they interact. So affordable housing can refer to two things, which is why I'm going to talk about those two things instead. First is the market price of housing, how much housing costs if you get on Zillow and go out and try to buy a house. And secondly is subsidized housing. These are government programs which provide either public housing or vouchers or rent controlled that provide some kind of public subsidy to housing. So oftentimes people use this word, but they're referring to one of these two things, and so I'm going to distinguish those things. And this is important because when people say that we have an affordable housing problem, we need to understand what problem they're talking about. There are two different problems they could be talking about. One of them is the market price of housing in Waynesboro too high? So that's one very distinct problem. What's too high? Generally, an economic argument would be that the price of housing should roughly reflect the cost of land, labor, and materials to construct a house, right? So if the housing prices are significantly higher than the cost of land, labor, and materials, that probably suggests your market price is too high, and you have a market house price problem. The second issue is subsidized housing, and the question that the speaker could be asking is there enough subsidized housing? And in that case, you have the question of what is the purpose of subsidized housing? What is affordable for people? Are there enough government programs involved that are providing housing? So let's talk first about the market price of housing. Again, the market price of housing is determined by supply and demand. Optimally, a house should cost about as much as it costs to pay for labor, materials, and land to construct a new house. An older house might be slightly less expensive than a new house, just like an older car is less expensive than a new car. But when there's strong demand for your housing stock, when your city's growing, people are hopefully keeping up their houses, most of the cost of those houses should reflect the cost to build a house. Housing supply is built up over time. Houses last 30 to 300 years. And likewise, it takes a long time for construction to happen as well. I just gave you an example during the subdivision ordinance of a project that came to us in early 2020 and is just now about to deliver some of its first houses. There's often about a 2-year lag in construction projects. So when there are sudden demand spikes, such as happened recently, you'll often get a sort of a temporary spike in prices as it takes time for new construction to come online. But that spike can not always be temporary, and that indicates that you have a deeper problem with your market price. Likewise, if demand falls, if a lot of people don't want to live here anymore, all those houses still exist. And in that case, the price of those houses will fall below the cost to construct a new house. And in that sense, housing can actually be too cheap, and that can be a real problem too. And I think Waynesboro had that problem to a certain extent maybe 10 years ago. If you bought your house and you got insurance on it and the insurance gave you a replacement cost for the house, and that was a lot higher than what you paid for the house, that indicates that there's a lot of housing stock that we're using, but that it's not generating enough. We don't have enough demand to keep that housing stock up, to maintain it. So that's the market price. Now, the market price of housing is going up pretty dramatically in Waynesboro right now. Some of that I think we can take credit for, as we've created a great community that people want to be in, but a lot of it is stuff that has nothing to do with us. Regional pressure from a growing housing crisis in the Charlottesville metro area, heightened costs and low inventory in Stanton, growing demand in the Harrisonburg area. All around us we have areas that are growing. And then there's also nationally an increased demand for space. Generally people are expressing a preference for more square footage, which means more demand for the existing housing stock. And because of being able to work from home, having low interest rates, a lot of savings during the pandemic, people are more able to purchase that space. And so there's a national crisis happening as well. So there's things that are happening locally, and then there's things that are happening regionally and nationally as well. Just to give you an idea of what housing costs right now in Waynesboro, these are our home sales, all of our home sales in the city. Anybody remember from math what a box and whisker plot is here? But the box is your 25th to 75th percentile, kind of your core price range, and then there's some outliers at either end. But if you're thinking about, I want a cheap house, I'm looking at the bottom end of the market. So let's look at the 25th percentile, kind of the still the meaty part of the bell curve, but on the cheap end. In 2022, that number was $215,000 for all sales. So that is kind of your basic cost of a cheap house in Waynesboro. That corresponds to about a $1,200-1,300 mortgage, and probably $1,500 to $1,800 rent. Single-family assessments were up 10.7% from 2017 to 2019, 14.5% from 2019 to 2021. What is new housing cost? What does it cost to build a new house? Again, the 25th percentile I'm looking at here, it's a little more condensed because, with all houses, there are some beaters still out there, fixer-uppers that are way down. But with new housing, the absolute cheapest new house that was built in the city of Waynesboro this year cost about $210,000. And the 25th percentile was at $270,000. So when you think about the minimum price to build a new house, that's what it's at. What does rental housing cost? It's tough to tell. We've talked to the Redevelopment and Housing Authority, and they've given us some numbers of pretty dramatic growth over the last couple of years, but obviously we don't track rental contracts to the city, so we can't give you exact numbers, and census data is on a big lag. But if you just look currently on any of the listing sites, you don't have very many units listed available, and the median rent is currently at about $1,200. There's no availability currently at most of our major apartment complexes. Our newest apartments, our most expensive ones, are at Windy Grove, and they currently have no availability, but their units generally range from about $1,200 to $1,800. Multifamily assessments are up 7% from 2017 to 2019, and up 15% from 2019 to 2021. So that is the housing market. So now I'm going to talk about subsidized housing, and these are, again, government programs that attempt to provide or mitigate the cost of housing for people. Why do we provide subsidized housing? Let me just clarify that we, the city, do not provide subsidized housing. All these programs are run through the state and federal government, largely administered by the Redevelopment and Housing Authority, and there are good reasons for that separation. But the city can hinder or support those projects to a certain extent. And the reason we provide subsidized housing is just that no matter how good your housing market is or how bad it is, there are always going to be members of your community who are unable to afford housing that meets our minimum standards for what's acceptable. About half of our public housing residents in Waynesboro are either elderly or disabled and unable to work. The rest are mostly all working but are unable to find housing that costs less than 30% of their income. And that's generally a benchmark that's used within the subsidized housing world for affordability. So if you get a housing voucher, for instance, they'll approve you for a certain amount. You'll have to go on the open market, and then you will pay 30% of your income. So if your income is $2,000 in a month, you'll pay 30% of that, $600, and then whatever the difference is between that and the market price of that unit will be paid by the voucher. But even so, our wait list is full. In fact, the RHA only opens the wait list every 2 years just because of the massive amount of demand that they've experienced lately for folks who are low income, elderly, or disabled who are struggling to find housing on the open market, especially as the prices have spiked in the last few years. Some of our cheapest apartment complexes that in the past have provided a big baseline of affordability for folks are going up pretty dramatically. There's a lot of different programs, different ways that works. We have 188 units of public housing in the city, and that's direct, publicly owned, managed by the WRHA. We have about 390 currently housing choice vouchers, formerly known as Section 8. Those are the vouchers I was explaining that allow people to bid on the open market. And then we have also several hundred units that are owned by nonprofits or private companies that have income restrictions. So if you think about our housing stock, there's a bar chart here. I put up public housing, income restricted, and housing vouchers, just to drive the point home that while these are significant programs with a significant cost and they provide a large service, 90% of your housing stock is rented on the open market. And so that it really matters what the market price is for affordability. So, and then about 98%, because income restricted properties and housing vouchers have a significant amount of exposure to the market. So it can still be hard to find. You can get a housing voucher, but if you can't find a market rent within the range allowed for by that housing voucher, you can still lose it and lose housing. So 98% of your people or of your households are exposed to the market. So again, these are two different issues, the market price of housing and subsidized housing, but they do interact. And so I'm going to make two big points here. The first one is that you cannot address a problem with the market price of housing through subsidies. And a lot of cities get into this kind of hamster wheel. But it doesn't go anywhere. And the second is that you can't address a lack of subsidized housing simply by lowering the market price in the end. So now if you have a market price problem, you can address that problem. But even after you've gotten the market price down all the way and you have a perfectly open housing market, again, there will always be some people who are not able to pay for the basic land, labor, materials to construct a house. So why doesn't subsidized housing work well as a solution to a market price problem? Well, a market price problem suggests, remember, supply and demand, that you have insufficient supply for the demand for your housing. And so the people who are most able to pay will get houses, and the people who are not will not. You start to involve subsidies in that program without increasing supply, and you're really just shuffling the chairs around, sort of playing musical chairs with all that stuff. But also, your cost to subsidize go up rapidly. There are a lot fewer vouchers available, and this is something the RHA has pointed out, that as the market price of housing goes up, they have a fixed amount of money in the voucher program as well, and so there are fewer vouchers that they're able to provide to people as the costs go up. And the wait lists increase. Generally, again, if costs go up, it's an indication that more people would like housing than currently have it, which means that you're probably also going to get longer wait lists for your public housing as well. And lastly, whenever you have a tight housing market, renters' power is significantly reduced. I think you're hearing a lot of complaints now from folks about my landlord didn't respond to this or that. And you know, you would hope in a housing market that the renter would say, well, I'm going to move to a different spot then. But your power is reduced when you don't have options to move to a different spot. So again, a lot of cities get into a little bit of a cycle where they create a market price problem, and then they want to try to solve that with a lot of subsidy programs, but they're just playing musical chairs if they're not increasing that supply, if they're not addressing that market problem. But conversely, you can also have a lack of subsidy problem that you're not addressing through market. You can have a market price that reflects accurately the cost of land, labor, and materials, and some of that is going to be just a lack of federal and state programs, and so some of that ball is out of your court, but there are ways in which the city affects that. Some of the biggest ways are regulatory. So the type of housing really matters to affordability. And again, I want to say requiring high-quality housing is not a bad thing. The city's made up of its buildings. It's only as good as its buildings. So we want people to be spending money on good buildings and keeping those buildings up. But that said, every time you put in a regulation to require a good building, you're raising the floor on what housing costs for people. So if you think about my little income ladder here, you know, you're going to have people that can afford nice mansions, people that can afford single-family homes, people that can afford cheaper, you know, attached housing like townhouses, duplexes, people that can only afford, you know, the cheapest type of structured housing, which is garden apartments, people that can afford mobile homes, and at the bottom you're going to have people who can't afford to do much other than set up a tent, or, you can see in a lot of less developed nations that you'll have huge slum areas and people just erect whatever structure they're capable of erecting. In this country, we tend to set high minimum standards for housing. We'll look at this and say, well, you're not allowed to do that. We don't want people living this way in our community, and so we say, well, you have to build structures that are minimally safe, minimally protective from the elements, have indoor plumbing. All that has a cost. The cheapest possible apartment you can build probably costs you $100,000 a unit, so that's not free. And so the number of options that you take away on the bottom is going to affect how many people require a subsidy. So all that to say, just think about that as you think about the types of housing that are allowed and are regulated, that it's a legitimate goal to want better buildings, better housing in the community, but every time that you raise that standard, you say, well, we don't want any apartments here, we don't want any mobile homes here. You're increasing the number of people that are going to require some kind of subsidy, or they're going to end up homeless in your community or something like that. And then the second big point on this, the way that you affect it, is density really matters. This is obviously an airplane seating diagram. Pretty good illustration of density. Space is scarce on an airplane, and so you pay more up in the suite class for more space. And if there's more space per seat, then there are fewer people on the plane, and then there need to be more people paying for that. A lot of cities get into a cycle where the people up here say that, isn't it a shame that these people back here have so little space? Either for benevolent reasons, they say, well, we really ought to require a minimum amount of space for housing. People shouldn't have that little space, or they just don't like that people are crowded in that much near them. So steadily they create higher and higher land requirements, minimum land standards, and those work the same way as the ladder that I just showed you, and they set a higher floor, and so they limit ultimately the number of people. So if you had folks up here in the suite class that said, well, we can only have sky suites all the way through the plane, no more economy class, they will end up in a situation where everyone who's on the plane has more space, but everyone is also paying more, and about half of these people just have to get off the plane. So that same thing happens with housing in a city. Density is a big factor in cost in a built-out area. And there's a trade-off here. It's oftentimes confusing for people. They'll start to get the idea that, well, because some inner city areas are very poor, dense housing must be all poor people. And then other people say, well, no, because high-rises are very expensive, dense housing must be very expensive. It's both. There are two different scales going on here. There's prime locations, and then there's density. So people who are at the upper end of the bidding chain will get prime locations and lower density. People at the bottom will get peripheral bad locations and higher density. And then people in the middle will have a trade-off. They'll either be able to take less space to be in a better location, or they'll be able to be in a further out location but get more space. So all those things are interacting. But again, just like the plane, if you're requiring, for instance, 5,000 square foot lots, so you have a 20,000 square foot square here, then you can get 4 different families on that lot, and they can all share the cost of that land. If you say you need a minimum 20,000 square foot lot, that means that the cost of that land will remain the same. It'll be slightly higher, and then all those other people will have to go somewhere else. Now, where do those people go? In the city of Waynesboro, we're not hugely space constrained. Augusta County tends to be fairly pro-development. We have a lot of greenfield development happening. So we're not probably in a situation where we're at great risk of a crisis. Probably creating large minimum lot sizes just pushes people further out, which does increase costs because they have to pay for additional infrastructure rather than using existing infrastructure, and they're not able to be in as prime a location. But it probably doesn't create a huge supply crisis. In other localities, like for instance in Charlottesville, they have a urban growth boundary in Albemarle County, which limits the growth of the city. Or in a city like Washington, D.C., that's just already so big that it's really at its max size. It already takes too long to drive across as it is. Then you run out of land, and then this quickly creates a crisis. There's just not enough chairs to go around, and they start to get bid up very rapidly. And that's how you end up with, I visited a friend in D.C. who had a 3-bedroom townhouse that was worth about $1.3 million, and that it did not cost that much to construct. That's a product of a limited number of spots available and people bidding up the value of those spots. So So that's a lot of stuff. I hope it gives you some helpful information as you think about housing affordability in the future. Again, when someone starts complaining about an affordable housing problem, ask what the problem is. Are they looking on Zillow and seeing prices that they think are too high and ridiculous? And are those prices actually higher than the cost to construct a house? Or are they talking about, the market price is fine, but there are people who are mentally ill, who are disabled, who are not able to work, or who low-wage jobs and children take care of and stuff, and they need more subsidized programs. So two different issues. I can't necessarily tell you how to fix your problem, but I can tell you how to make it a lot worse. So here's how to make, if you would like to have an affordable housing problem, here's how to do it. You would want to start by limiting the type of housing that's allowed in the community. Again, every time you do that, you're kicking more people out who would be able to afford something, but saying that that's not good enough for your community, and so they're going to have to go be subsidized up to that point. The analogy I use sometimes is that for a little while I lived in a neighborhood that my parents thought was fairly dangerous, but it was very cheap, and I was in grad school. So they said, well, why don't you live in this neighborhood? Well, that neighborhood costs more. So if you were in a position to make a rule and say, well, you have to move to that neighborhood, well, you would need to also provide me with a subsidy to get me up to the point where I can afford that. So the second way that you could make your problem worse is you could limit density in infill areas, and this would create scarcity, again, for land and reduce the number of people that fit on the plane. And then the third way you can make your problem worse is just don't plan ahead. Don't make infrastructure investments. Just try to make infrastructure as expensive as possible. Infrastructure is a big part of the cost of expanding the city. Building more of it makes houses more expensive. And not planning ahead, not thinking about things that the city has already done well in the past. I mean, considering our water capacity, sewer capacity, not making prudent investments in those things, and not thinking critically about where is there going to be demand in the future, how much, what kinds of investments are going to pay off, can result in, down the line, you not being able to support development and your costs going up, or the development having to pay all those costs. So that's how to make your problem worse. Again, my key takeaways are some people in your community cannot afford good housing without assistance, and probably will never be able to. And so those will be largely federal and state programs, but the city can be supportive of those. We can support those new developments in any place possible, and try to create a better, more welcoming environment for that. But most housing in Waynesboro is bought, sold, and rented on the open market, and there are a lot of ways to make that problem a lot worse very quickly. So any questions on any of that?
Great presentation, Luke.
Thanks.
Very informative.
I always have a question, Luke, you know that. We've had a lot of subdivisions that are being
Yes.
planned. We've got a lot that are partially built. What is our mix? I mean, we have the townhouses, we have some of the condos at Windy Grove. I mean, do you have a sense of what that mix looks like?
Yeah, I mean, so the mix is going to be affected by two things: what we allow, and then what the market is demanding, what the developers are seeing that people are able to buy and willing to pay for. Generally, what people are able to buy right now and want to pay for tends to be attached townhouses, not so much apartments, though. Folks, there is definitely strong demand for apartments, and not so much single-family homes. The kind of key price point that a lot of developers are trying to hit often involves townhouses or some kind of attached houses. I would say that that's harder to get approval for. People tend to not like attached housing being near them as much as they like single-family homes being near them. So we have a lot of subdivisions that are trying to get to a smaller or a cheaper single-family home, and so we have some of that going on up Ivy Street. But I would say that we've probably 2/3 of the unit that are under construction now or that are platted are single-family homes, leaning towards smaller single-family or cheaper single-family homes and smaller lots. And then we have maybe a fourth of them are townhouses or some kind of attached units. What does that leave me with? Math people. Sixth, something like that. And then there's some percentage that are apartments that have been approved. We haven't approved a major apartment complex since Windy Grove, but there are a couple proposals in the works. So there's clearly interest. Again, they're seeing really quickly increasing rents, and so a lot of developers are starting to take notice of that.
Thank you.
I've seen, some, disruptive strategies that some communities employ of the city or community outright purchasing land for the use of but then gifting it to a redevelopment housing association to then facilitate development. That basically disrupts the private marketplace, right, by inserting a public investment. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around it for a community our size, for that scale.
Right.
Something Harrisonburg. I think City of Harrisonburg just recently did a partnership with their RHA, right, where they're I forget how many acres, but it was a substantial amount of acreage that was purchased, gifted to the RHA. Then they pursued a combination of DCHD, HUD, and other Virginia Housing Association Authority grants and loans to build those units.
Yeah, I think you're right when you say that the costs are very high to construct and provide public housing and tend to exceed what a locality is able to pull off. Usually when a locality is supporting a subsidized housing project, like you're talking about, that I would count as a subsidized government program, then you're doing it through maybe a land acquisition or helping with some infrastructure. Like we have a proposal to contribute some money towards a road improvement project that will connect two neighborhoods that need to be connected, but also will open up some land for Habitat for Humanity to develop. So that's an example of a way that the city can support a subsidized housing project, but is not necessarily, getting into building them. Obviously, the cost, the revenue that we acquire is about 1% of the value of houses in the city, and the cost to build a house is 100% of the value of the house. And so you're not going to build a lot of houses on, the revenue that the city generates. So generally, the ways to support it are through infrastructure, maybe through helping them with land deals, sometimes just providing political support for a project,
Or even the combination of that pivoting from the entitlement, right, of the CDBG, is that if we had a big investment, so say if we did a competitive grant for $1.5 million that would do the infrastructure component of
Right.
publicly held but not city held property, then
Yeah.
there's disruptive things, but it does
Yeah.
require so all this saying is like kind of where to go from here. I mean, I would be interested. The city of Harrisonburg applied for and received, I think, a $50,000 housing grant from VHA, right, to do a market-based analysis of what would be some strategies to do that, because I think this is incredibly informative, and I kept on thinking, like, does he teach this in his class? Because it was very, very well done. But I thought, for those at home or might maybe watch this on YouTube down the road, is so where do we go from here, right? I mean, because at some level, it's a question I think for us to deliberate upon when we consider priorities for the city or otherwise. Is maybe part of the comprehensive planning thing, but to do a real snapshot in partnership with RHA to figure out what is our role. Do we have a role in offering? Because it's with our inventory of rezoned, platted, but not yet built. OMG, if the market didn't start cooling pretty fast, which it probably is, we'd have it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, I will say that, talking about the subsidized housing programs, which I emphasize are necessary, that the city tends to be a secondary player in most of those programs, but you're very much the primary player in the market price of housing. Really, the number one actor in affecting the market price of housing is local governments. Now, they do so at a regional level, so just you acting individually, it takes action from all the localities in the region, but it's a big, heavy lift oftentimes to do that. The one thing I would say is if you do get involved in a subsidized housing project, the best way to ensure that helps both of these problems is to ensure that it's adding supply and not that it's removing supply from the market, purchasing existing houses and putting them under some kind of affordability restriction. Again, that's just shuffling your problem around. So, but a subsidy ideally helps, when something is subsidized, the goal is to create more of it. So you want to do subsidy programs like that are constructing additional housing.
So my thought is, like, if the choice is, I could, my ROI is 200% of doing a townhome, compact townhome development versus, an apartment complex that I got to invest a little more time and resource and patience in.
Yeah.
In a hot market, I'm probably building the townhomes, as fast as I can. It's really interesting. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Thank you all.
Thank you, Luke. Very good program. All right, item number 12 is to consider introducing an ordinance amending Chapter 2 Administration of City Code. Mr. Hamp.
Yes, sir. You'll recall that the General Assembly legislated that local elections, those city council and school boards, must be conducted in November. The city worked with our General Assembly members to accomplish the necessitated changes to our charter related to November elections. The attached ordinance, however, affects the necessary changes to the city code which relate to the election of mayor, vice mayor, and appointment of charter officials. And so, to a great extent, this is some additional housekeeping that's related to the fact that May elections are moving to November, and there are elements in the code that require some adjustment in that regard. Ms. Michelson, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think one of the things that we've got to decide is whether we're going to put a new slate in place July, to run from July till January, and then have another slate come in January, or do we continue the mayor, vice mayor, and staff that we have until January 2022? Is that correct?
Correct. So, Ms. Michelson has advised that you can have a full-on organizational meeting as if we had just gone through the elections and elect a new mayor, a new vice mayor for a term of 6 months. Then you'll simply just have to repeat that process after the November elections in January. Or by general consensus among the body, you can say we're just going to keep the slate that we have now and await the results of the election. And the same is true for your charter officials.
Any discussion from council on that?
I thought Mr. J was going to present this, so I was a little disappointed. I don't straight.
In any case, this evening, we're simply introducing, and you'll have until July 11th to determine how you want to move forward.
Okay. Okay. All right, so,
Do you want a discussion now? I mean, my opinion would be to carry forward for the next 6 months, and
Dad, you say if it isn't broke, don't fix
if it
it.
ain't broke, don't fix it, so.
all right. So is there a motion to introduce the ordinance as presented tonight by Mr. Hamp?
I will make that motion.
Thank you, Dr. Hostetter. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Allen. Any discussion? This will carry over till our July 11th meeting, correct? Perfect. Then item number 13 is consider adopting an ordinance appropriating $600,000 from the CARES ESSER 3 grant to the school's fund for capital replacement. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members of council. This ordinance is requested by the school board. They received some additional monies through the same legislation that we received our CARES Act funds through, but these are separate monies straight from the VDOE, Virginia Department of Education, to them. Part of those funds were to be used for for some construction and renovation at Berkeley Glen. They were able to get some of that construction done during fiscal year 2022, so they're asking that we go ahead and appropriate the funds. And this can be introduced and adopted this evening if council desires.
Perfect. Any questions for Mr. McCormick? Is there a motion to adopt the ordinance appropriating $600,000 from CARES to the school fund?
So moved.
All right, Mr. Short, is there a second?
Yes.
Mr. Allen? Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Thank you all very much. And then item number 14, correspondence, communication, and calendar. Mr. Hamp.
I don't have anything this evening, sir.
Nothing tonight, okay. And then item number 15 is citizen comment period. And if we have citizens that signed up to speak tonight, Same rules as always. We've got the little stoplight up here. When you start talking, the light will turn green. You'll have 4 minutes to speak. After you've told council what you want us to hear, you can stop speaking, but if you've got more to say and the light turns yellow, you've got 30 seconds and to start winding down. Once it turns red, we kindly ask you to step back and let someone else come up to speak.
Craig Scott.
Mr. Scott.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, honorable councilman. 1616 Armistead Road, Ward B. As you know, I've talked previously about turning liabilities to assets, improving the cash flow, broadening the base, and lowering the burden for the individual citizens of our fair city. Once the revenues come in, though, we haven't addressed that and modernized our management, our cash management of our city. It would, since Richmond has blown our city charter out of the water, excuse me, I think a modernization of our cash management system would be in order, especially with the impending interest rates are rising, as you know, and will probably be for the next 10 to 15 years. Double digits will affect the housing market when mortgages go to double digits, as an example, besides the exogenous forces that are coming in to our city. In that light, I would recommend the city, in a city charter, or some form of amendment process, and I will look into it if needed, and I'll be happy to do a more detailed presentation when it's optimal, is a modernization of a cash sweeping type system, and with surplus funds that are actively earning interest, especially when interest rates are going to be going to double digit in the near future, and things are going to be hard for the city as it will be for the rest of the country and maybe the planet. So you could ladder T-bills, for example, AA, AAA investment grade stuff, earn interest. Instead of borrowing money, we could 1 to 12-month T-bills, for example. Super secure and liquid, and maybe even earning a little bit of interest to go back into the treasury, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars per annum. So I recommend, the bottom line is, and there are ways, maybe you're familiar with it in your own walks of life, maybe your business account, your brokerage account has a sweep, your 401k, others. I recommend, again, modernization, and this would be one arrow in that proverbial quiver. And I think I see no downside, especially during an economic downturn, which I believe there will be in the next 12 months. But let's hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, as the old analogy goes. So, managing on the income side and the debit side. But once you have these funds, let's implement them in an optimal way and have them working for us after the fact. I don't know if anybody questions. I know this is not the forum for it, but it's not rocket science, because I'm certainly no rocket science, although I know one. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
As always, Mr. Scott, thank you very much for your input. All right, that ends citizen comment period. That brings us to the last order of business. Is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
I'll make that motion.
Mr. Allen, is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Short, any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Meeting's adjourned.